Welcome to Meet the Experts. My name is Jeff Dalrymple. I'm the Executive Director at Evangelical Council for Abuse Prevention. And it's our honor to have you join us today. We're glad to have and honored to have Dr. Mike Kruger from RTS Charlotte talking about his book, Bully Pulpit. And so we'll get started momentarily. But first of all, we're absolutely thrilled to have this Meet the Experts brought to you by Gospel Care Collective. And so my good friend Jason Kovacs is here with us on Zoom. And I'd like to just let Jason give a greeting and tell you a little bit about his ministry and the work they're doing at Gospel Care Collective.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, our ministry is Gospel Care Collective. We do three things. We do counseling. We do gospel-centered, clinically informed, biblical counseling online. We have a team of counselors. We do a lot of counseling for trauma, abuse, but really everything, even see adolescents. So we're serving churches that don't have access to good, solid biblical counseling where they are. We're passionate about seeing counseling spread and be established locally. So we do training as well. That's the second thing we do. We're a training center for the Association of Biblical Counselors. So we provide a certification in biblical counseling. And then we do consulting for churches around how to establish a culture of care, a healthy culture, and then work with churches on conflict resolution, those sorts of things, mediation, and just love to see. We're grateful for this topic, grateful for the conversation, because we see a lot of the impact of this in the counseling room and in churches that we're working with. So thanks for having us.
Jason, it's a joy. Jason and I actually go back to Southern Seminary when I was on staff there, and we did Adopting for Life with Russ Moore, and that's when we first met. And now Jason lives in Southern California, but he is joining us in his country, Canada. So thank you so much for being with us. Well, Evangelical Council for Abuse Prevention exists to help churches create safe places for kids to hear the gospel and to grow in discipleship. And the topic of spiritual abuse frequently comes up. There's a little bit of overlap in child protection. And so as soon as Bully Pulpit came out, I picked up a copy and I read it and couldn't put it down. And so it caused me to reach out to Dr. Mike Kruger from RTS and just learn more about his story and why he wrote the book. And so I'm going to introduce Dr. Kruger. Dr. Kruger, president of RTS Charlotte campus, and he is the Samuel C. Patterson Professor of New Testament and Early Christianity at RTS. Also, he contributes regularly on his site, michaeljkruger.com, which Brigham, our general editor, is going to drop into the link here. Be sure, as we get started here, to just give a greeting to the group in the chat. Just some quick housekeeping. We'd like to know who you are, where you hail from, and what ministry you serve with. So if you don't mind, just drop that into the chat. We're glad that you're here. This is being recorded, and ECAP will post the recording of this Meet the Experts on our YouTube channel. Dr. Kruger, I'm going to turn it over to you if you don't mind sharing a little bit more about yourself and the book and, of course, why you read it. And then we'll open this up to our audience to ask questions. So be sure to click on the Slido link there in the chat and start sending your questions in for bottom of the hour. Dr. Kruger?
Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate that introduction and great to be with you all. Thanks for jumping on the call here. This is one of those topics that I know that is important to many of us, and I'm looking forward to having a chance to discuss it with you today. I saw the advertisement that said sort of meet the expert. I'm not sure I'm the expert here, but maybe in my real field of New Testament canon and textual criticism, maybe I'm a little more of one. But here, this is new territory for me. So that's probably a good place to begin. I've done a lot of podcasts on this book since I wrote it. And one of the most common things I get asked is, why in the world are you, a New Testament scholar, writing a book on spiritual abuse? Isn't this a little bit sort of a sidebar here, a little bit of a different pathway? And I get that. I really understand that, you sort of make your way in the academy in a certain field. And in my field, it hasn't changed. I'm still writing and publishing in that field. In fact, I've got a book right now I'm finishing up academic monograph on canon related issues. But I remind people that I'm also a seminary president, and I'm also a pastor. And as someone who's thinking a lot about leadership in the church and training leaders for the church and what future leaders in the church ought to look like, I've tried to pay attention, like all of us over the last 5 or 10 years, about the landscape of evangelical Christianity, particularly in the Western world. And I've just grown more and more concerned as time has ticked by, and as I've watched not only the public cases I'm sure we could all list unfold as it pertains to spiritual abuse, but I'm sure all of us could tell stories of cases we've seen in our own circles that are not famous cases or public cases, but certainly cases that have made an impact on you. And I've seen those too. I've seen cases up close and personal that are really have been disturbing and concerning. And it's just become more and more clear to me over time that, wow, this is an issue that needs more attention. And it particularly needs more attention from someone who's other than a victim of spiritual abuse. And this is one of the key things that motivated me to write the book. We want to hear from those who are survivors of spiritual abuse. And they've written books, and I welcome those and think they're really, really important. But I think if we're going to move the ball down the field, we have to have people who are actually in leadership in seminaries and churches speak also into this issue. So it's coming from our own ranks, so that leaders are saying we as leaders need to give some consideration and some thoughts to the types of leaders we're producing, the types of leaders we're wanting, and the types of leaders we're promoting. And so I wrote the book out of love for the church and out of a desire to see her produce gentle, humble, godly leaders like Christ. And I don't presume for a moment that my book is going to be the solution to all of that. There's much more work that needs to be done, but hopefully it's a small step in the right direction. As I already indicated, my book is got a rather narrow goal. My goal is not to say everything about spiritual abuse. My goal is really written as a book from a leader to other leaders and to institutions to help them sort of recognize it's a problem, learn how to spot it, and then learn how to stop spiritual abuse and prevent it when they can. So I didn't really write the book so much for those who've been abused, although I've gotten a lot of emails since it came out from people who've been abused saying how encouraged they are by it, and I'm really glad for that. But my main audience, at least, was not so much how to handle abuse if you've experienced it, although I hope that the book is beneficial in that way at some level, but mainly it's designed to call attention to this issue as far as other leaders go and help them realize that, hey, this is real. This isn't something that we're just making up. This is a problem that needs attention, and I hope we can give careful thought to it. So those are the things that have motivated me to write the book. And I'll tell you, since I started blogging on this a number of years ago, even before the book came out, I have been sort of whelmed with the response that's triggered. And for those of you who are involved in ministry related to abuse, you probably could tell similar stories. But when I first blogged on spiritual abuse on my website, I was just inundated with private emails from people from all over the country and the world, actually saying, thank you for writing on this. And here's my story. They just sent me, some of these were like 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 page emails, just telling me their story. And I received so many of these, and it reminded me that there's some, we're tapping in an issue that I think is visceral for people, and it really does need to be addressed. And just seeing that reaction reminded me of how important it is. And even to this day, it's the most downloaded and most read blog series on my site. Of course, that may say more about my site than anything else. I don't know. But regardless, it still is the most, maybe people just want to read on this more than they want to read on canon. But nonetheless, it is still gotten the most attention. And then even in private conversations with people, when they found out I've written on this, I regularly have people stop and say, hey, that happened to me, or I read your articles and that described exactly what happened in my church. I've even had people write me so convinced that the things I had written sounded like what happened in their church, they thought I was talking about their church. This is a repeated thing. They're absolutely sure that I must be describing their pastor. And that just tells you how, in sort of almost an eerie way, how uniform the practices are. And that's what I tried to do in my book, is to document these, help people see these, and then hopefully bring some remedy to these. So let me just say a few quick words here. First, let me just say a word about spiritual abuse in terms of what it is and how I've tried to define it in my book. And then I just want to give a few broad thoughts for you as you lead your ministries on terms of prevention. And this isn't a lecture or anything, just a few comments. And then I'm going to turn it back over to Jeff, who will lead our Q&A. And that's an important time, and I hope a time you'll take advantage of. So first, spiritual abuse is a term that everyone's got a definition for. And when I wrote the book, I realized that people have all kinds of reactions to it. Some people like the term and they're fine with it. Some people think it's really bad. Some people think we shouldn't use it. Some people object to it, saying it's a modern therapeutic category we're imposing on the Bible. And then there's even legal implications of the term, and on it goes. And I won't rehash all that on this call. I deal with a number of these issues in my book. But after looking at all the pros and cons of all the definitions and all the different terminology, and I talk about this in the book, you could call it different things. I'm not opposed to that. I make a point to show in church history, this has been recognized by other pastors, other scholars, other theologians that go way back. One of the most notable examples of this is James Bannerman's book, The Church of Christ, which is 19th century. So you're talking very old book here, and he's in the thick of sort of the old school Presbyterianism, but yet he acknowledges there's this thing we would now call spiritual abuse. He didn't use the terminology. He called it spiritual oppression or spiritual tyranny, which, okay, if someone wants to use that term, I'm fine with that. There's other terms: authoritarian leadership, heavy shepherding, on and on it goes. The terminology is to some extent secondary. The concept is what matters. And I define spiritual abuse conceptually as when a Christian leader, a spiritual leader, and some sort of authority over those under their care wields their authority in such a way that they become heavy-handed, domineering, and authoritarian to the flocks under their care. And that manifests itself in a lot of ways. It can manifest itself certainly in a person who's highly critical, highly defensive, retaliatory. It can manifest itself in terms of someone who's manipulative and vindictive, and on it goes. And I won't hash all that out here in this call. But I will point out, though, that the way I've defined spiritual abuse, at the heart of it is an issue of authority, right? It's how authority is wielded. If you take authority out of the equation, at least on the way I'm defining the term, you have other types of bad behavior, but you certainly wouldn't have spiritual abuse in the way I'm defining it. The way I'm defining it, it's when someone who's in a spiritual position of authority wields it in an ungodly way, and effectively becomes a bully. This is why I entitled my book "Bully Pulpit," which is a side note here. When I suggested the title to Zondervan, authors suggest titles all the time, and they're not always accepted. In fact, I've had a lot of titles from my other books that weren't accepted. But they really liked the title, and we were all surprised that no one had used it before. If you think about it, it's kind of an obvious title for the problem, but to our knowledge, at least, no one's used the title for a discussion of spiritual abuse. But that really is what it is. It's when a person's a spiritual bully and throws their authority around in ungodly ways. Now, one other thing about the definition I'll mention here that's important is the definition acknowledges that authority in the spiritual realm is real. That's why abuse is real, because authority is real. And one of the things theologically I point out in the book is I think biblically there is such a thing as spiritual authority. I do think churches and leaders have a degree of authority. I think those are real things that God ordains. I think some people have tried to solve the abuse problem by just eliminating all authority, just taking it away. I don't think that's the solution. I think the solution is to recognize that authority can be misused and authority can be abused, and we ought to have categories for that. And so the authority is real, but our definition of it and our understanding of it is often very warped. And that is part of the reason I wrote the book, is to hope to recalibrate what we mean when we talk about the abuse of spiritual authority. Here's the other thing I'll say about spiritual abuse before I mention a few tips for you as you think about your ministries and churches. And that is, I don't think it's anything new. One of the questions I've gotten asked all the time in a lot of the podcasts I've done, and I haven't even added up all the podcasts I've done, but they're probably more than I should have done. But one of the questions I get asked is this a new problem? Now, there's two different angles to that. One is it worse now than it was? That's an interesting question, and I have no way to measure that. There's no real hard statistical studies on spiritual abuse that I'm aware of, at least. It's very hard to measure. It's very anecdotal, and it doesn't have the concrete scientific dimensions to it that other kind of abuse has. So we're, as a church, really on the front end of this. So when someone says, is it worse now than it was 10 years ago? I don't know. Maybe we just know about it more because of social media. Maybe it's just our awareness that's gone up. Now, if you were to ask me what my gut is that it is worse. But I don't have any basis for that in terms of scientific study or anything. All that said, though, I want to be very clear about this. Even if it's worse now than it was 10 years ago, it's still not new. From the dawn of time, since the fall of humanity, since sin entered the world and God cursed the world through Adam and Eve, people have lorded it over other people in sinful ways. And one of the things I point out in my book is that the concept of oppressive, harsh leadership is all over the Bible. And if you've read the book, some of you may have, some of you may not have gotten it yet. I have a whole chapter on this where I've walked through kind of literally from Genesis to Revelation, showing all the instances where, not exhaustively, but at least some of the main instances where we see this sort of mishandling of spiritual authority and how the Bible very much recognizes it and very much is serious about it, and that God is very upset by it. And then in the New Testament, of course, when pastoral ministry is discussed, it's mentioned over and over again, and often it's mentioned in the corollary. So it's don't be a bully, plektos in the Greek, don't be pugilistic, but then it's mentioned positively, be gentle. So you have to realize that when the New Testament pushes towards gentle leadership, it is yet another way it's addressing the problem, right? Because a gentle leader is by definition not a bully leader. And so whatever a person wants to call this, like I said, I think the terminology is to some extent secondary. I think it's a historic biblical category that has been recognized not only throughout church history, but throughout biblical history, and one that I hope the church can take more seriously. Now, let me move on to the last thing I want to say here, which is, I think Jeff wanted me to mention, and I'm happy to do this, some thoughts for you as leaders and for those who are working in church or ministry spaces around abuse. One of the most common questions I get is, well, what can my church do so that we don't become this kind of church? Or what can my Christian ministry do so that we don't become this kind of church? And so part of it here is dealing with the issue of danger, or maybe the idea that you could become this if you're not careful. And so I just want to mention just a few quick sort of principles that I think can help you think about your ministries in ways that I think can send it on a path that's healthy rather than a path that's problematic. And if it's a path that's problematic, it doesn't necessarily mean that your ministry, your church is actively abusive. It just may mean it's unhealthy and could become that over time if things aren't addressed. So let me just mention, and I know this sounds like I'm going to spend a lot of time on this. I'm really not, but let me just mention 5 little quick tidbits for you, and I'll just list them out and then say a quick word about each of them. Here's 5 suggestions for you as you think about your ministry. Emphasize, first, character over competency. Character over competency. Second, teamwork over hierarchy. Third, transparency over secrecy. Fourth, shepherding over fault finding. And then finally, openness over defensiveness. I am not going to give an extensive comment on each of these. I will say a couple quick words, and then I'll open it up to Q&A. Again, I cover a lot of these principles in my book. Let me say something first about character over competency. One of the things I mention in my book, and that many of you know, is that when it comes to at least ordained Christian ministry, the Bible is very clear that character outweighs competency in dramatic ways. If you go to somewhere like 1 Timothy 3 and look at what God wants a pastor to be like, there's roughly 12 characteristics there, depending on how you count them. All of them but one pertain to character, and only one pertains to competency or giftedness. The only giftedness part that's mentioned there is the ability to teach. Everything else is about character. God values that much more than the ability to, quote, get things done, right? Or much more than the ability to be eloquent and persuasive and impressive. Now, I'm not suggesting that giftedness doesn't have its place in ministry, or that an ability of a person to do certain things doesn't help ministry. I want to acknowledge that freely. but it should never trump character. And here's what happens. When somebody is successful in ministry that can build a big church and a big online platform, and they're very famous and they sell a lot of books and fill the pews, what you realize is that when there's a character problem, it just gets overrun by the competency issue. It's ignored and not considered because the value is so much more for what that pastor can do than who they are in Christ. I want to suggest to you that that has gotten us down this path of spiritual abuse in some really important ways. Now, what do you do in your church to deal with that? Well, one of the ways I would suggest in my book, and I'm not going to go into this here, is you have to be very careful how you evaluate pastoral candidates or leader candidates. You know, are you just evaluating their doctrine, or are you really evaluating their character too? And character evaluation takes a lot more work than just simply, here's a survey or fill it out or list out all that you believe or think. It's going to take some extra steps, and I mentioned those in the book. Here's a second thought for you: teamwork over hierarchy. Again, I'm not going to spend much time on this, but one of the things that I think I would encourage churches to think about is make sure that when they think about what authority means, that they have a biblical model for it. If I were to say to a person, a pastor has authority, what they typically do is insert in their mind some figure in modern culture that has authority and assume that's what a pastor should be like. So, for example, when I say a pastor has authority, they think, oh, you mean like a football coach? You can scream and yell at your players and fire someone if they don't do a good job. Or maybe they think like a CEO, like he runs a big business. Or maybe they think like a military general or something like this. Now, there's an element of truth in all those things. And even the Bible uses some of those imageries for what a leader should be, okay? So we're not suggesting those don't have some validity. But what I want to suggest to you is that the hierarchical, top-down, heavy authoritarian model is just simply something we don't see in the Bible. Here's what I want to suggest to you. Leading the Bible often involves not just telling people what to do, but modeling for people what to do. It's not just simply leading by delivering orders, but leading by developing a consensus, developing buy-in, building relationships, building a team, which is why I think teamwork over hierarchy matters. Now, what does that mean? That means that Christian leadership tends to be slower. Christian leadership tends to take more time and is less efficient. Christian leadership is not about just, quote, getting it done and just having real high-powered people always, in your system. And I think, that type of different mentality of the way we lead, I think is going to be a really important corrective to the way some of the people conceive of authority in our modern world. Okay, a third thing here worth mentioning: transparency over secrecy. One of the things I think we all know that in abuse cases happens is that when something goes wrong in a church and there's an abuse scenario, one of the most disturbing things for people isn't just that the abuse happened. What is most disturbing for people, and I would argue even much worse in terms of the damage it does, is the response from the church or Christian ministry to the abuse that happens. It's not that different than the famous Watergate phrase, right? The cover-up was worse than the crime. I think there's some truth in that in abuse cases in churches. Abuse is bad enough, but when you minimize, silence, cover up, ignore the type of abuse that takes place, then there's another layer of harm that happens there in churches. What I want to suggest then is that churches need to be much more transparent in the way they operate and much more transparent in terms of how their leaders are doing. One of the things I bring up in the book that a lot of people don't know is that when it comes to the elder board at most churches, people don't realize that in many denominations, those elder board meetings are actually public meetings. And what I mean by that is anybody in the church can come and listen in. That doesn't mean you don't ever go to executive session for sensitive issues. You can do that, yes, but there is a sense in which the church's business is the people's business. The other thing I would say as it pertains to transparency over secrecy is doing serious annual reviews of all staff, not just the key leader, but every full-time staff and even some part-time staff under that key leader, so that there's a real clear picture of what's actually happening and what people are actually doing. Now, you may think annual reviews are par for the course and it's just common sense, and I would agree it is common sense, but I've been amazed how many people just don't do them. And by the way, one of the big tricks here is you can't just have an annual review of the leader. You have to have an annual review of the people under the leader so that it can protect them down the road. One of the things that often happens in abuse cases is that leader claims that some member of staff is a certain way, or they're this or they're that, or they're bad performing, or they're insubordinate or whatever. But if there's a track record of reviews that you can go back and show that actually that particular employee's had good reviews, and that this accusation is a new accusation, perhaps designed as a form of retaliation. And so those need to be considered. All right, fourth thing here as it pertains to this, and that is shepherding over fault finding. Shepherding over fault finding. One of the things that it marks an abusive leader in most churches is they what I call in the book, lead by fault finding. They're always on the watch for mistakes and goof ups and mess ups and inconsistencies and inefficiencies and problems. Now, one of the problems here is that it is true that shepherding at some level does involve correction. Shepherding at some level does involve church discipline. I think those are biblical concepts. But one of the dangers churches need to watch out for is a shepherding ministry that is focused on fault finding as its main thing, rather than care, encouragement, provision as the main thing. Any ministry where discipline is the main thing, I think, is going to run the danger of being an abusive ministry. I'll give you an example of this in normal everyday life. Imagine that there was a father who had a son, and he thought that pretty much his main job, if not his only job, was just to figure out what's wrong with his son and correct it. That's what a father thinks a father does, is that he finds the problems with his son and he corrects them. Well, you can see what's going to happen there. Rather than thinking of his job as provision or care or encouragement or teaching or protection, now the father is all about correction. So now he's on the watch for everything that's wrong with his 13-year-old son, always looking for ways to fix it and set it right, supposedly. And pretty soon you have a household environment that's heavy and oppressive and is all about fault finding. Churches can become this. This is what you need to realize. Leaders can become this way, and churches can become this way. This doesn't mean that church discipline isn't real or important. It is. But we have to be very careful that we don't make that the main thing. If you look at Psalm 23, the shepherd is caring for his sheep, protecting his sheep, providing for sheep. Yes, there's a place for bringing the sheep back and disciplining them, if we want to say it that way. But that's not the core. The core is care and provision. And we need to remember that when we set up our ministries. Okay, one last thing in the 5 here: openness over defensiveness. One of the key marks of an abusive leader, and honestly, this is something we can all relate to, is they get very defensive when they're criticized. And criticism happens in ministry. If you're in ministry for 5 minutes, you know that it's full of criticism. And we take a lot of heat as leaders in the church. And a lot of the criticism isn't even accurate. Let's be honest. Sometimes the criticism is just completely off base and false. So yes, there's a lot of bad criticism out there, and I can understand when people get defensive. However, there is a type of ministry that will not allow criticism, will not tolerate dissent, and creates a church culture that's always on the lookout for a coup or a rebellion, and is always looking to squash it before it gets out of the gate. Most abusive leaders are hyper defensive about their authority and their role, and that's the trigger often that sets off abusive behavior. I mentioned in the book, in the story of Mark Driscoll, one of the commentators on his situation, a guy by the name of Joel Brown, this is what he says about Driscoll, and it's quoted in Mars Hill and quoted in my book. He says this: there was always this underlying assumption that Mark had, that people were trying to take his power. People were trying to take his church from him. There was this constant desire to protect his power and make sure he maintained control. If a ministry is built on fear of losing it, which is effectively what that is, the fear of losing something is not a pathway to a healthy ministry. It's a pathway to an abusive ministry. I quote Yoda from Star Wars at the end of my book. Fear of loss is a path to the dark side, he says. And I think that's, that there's some Christian truth in that. The fear of loss is the path to a dark side. If a church is built primarily around protecting itself and making sure that things aren't lost, and making sure that the ministry is always looked at perfectly, there's going to be problems. What I would suggest instead is a ministry of openness and not defensiveness. And what does that mean? Set up systems by which people can voice their concerns, voice their complaints, and they can be heard actually in a way that doesn't squash them or retaliate against them. And who knows? This is one of the things that's interesting. Sometimes the criticisms are right. Sometimes they may be correct. And even if they're not correct, you know what you will have done by having an openness? You will create a sense that they're heard and listened to, and it creates peace, not war. You don't have to agree with the criticisms to be open to actually hearing them in a gentle and caring way. Okay, so those are 5 quick principles for you. They come from the book in various ways. So certainly you can go deeper into those when you get a chance to read through the book. Jeff, let me turn it back over to you here for questions, comments, or however you want to set up this next phase of things.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Kruger. Super helpful. 5 tips: character over competency, teamwork over hierarchy, accountability over secrecy, shepherding over fault finding, openness over defensiveness. And I think you're all drawing there from chapter 7 in your book. And so for those of you who are listening in, I want to just go ahead and offer you a free copy of Bully Pulpit. If you go to the ECAP website, contact us through the form there, mention Dr. Kruger and this Meet This Experts, and we'll mail. Don't forget to include your mailing address, right? And we'll send you a free copy of Bully Pulpit. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, can I do that? Can I get a free copy?
Yes, absolutely. If you autograph it for me. So Dr. Kruger, abuse, the word abuse gets thrown around a lot in our culture today. Can you talk briefly about what you're not referring to? Because, on page 22, you've got a section there, what spiritual abuse is not. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I tried to define it earlier in our brief time here. As Jeff indicates in the book, I go into a lot more detail here. First of all, the term abuse in our modern day, often we hear abuse, we think sexual abuse. Okay, we're not talking about that. As serious and as awful as that is, that's not what we're discussing. We're not talking about physical abuse. No hitting, no violence, no contact. And as I've indicated, we're talking about really something that sounds a lot more like what someone would say is something like emotional abuse or psychological abuse, some sort of spiritual oppression, as I think Bannerman would say. Also, one of the sections I have on the book is to not confuse everything with abuse. We want to be very careful. We just don't throw the term around every time there's a problem. So, for example, and this isn't exhaustive, just because your pastor has a low emotional IQ doesn't mean he's abusive. Okay, look, we know a lot of people in ministry are they're kind of thick as a board. They don't really get it. They don't really see you. They're not very good relationally. They forget your name. They don't ask for prayer requests. They got a bad bedside manner. They're kind of gruff. Okay. Doesn't help their ministry, but that's not abuse. Okay. Another thing that I mentioned is that abuse is not just having a conflict. Ministry is filled with conflict. Pastors make mistakes. They say things they shouldn't have said. There's disagreements and problems. Okay. We don't want to just say you're abusive because we had a conflict. However, one of the things to watch out for is a track record of conflict and a track record of destroyed lives. Well, now we're talking about probably something different. So I go through those things, and I won't go through them all here, but we need to make sure we're not too frivolous in throwing the term around.
I think you also mentioned, confrontation of sin, which is kind of lumped into the category today, right? If I'm a pastor and I'm confronting sinful behavior, that's not what you're talking about spiritual abuse. Obviously, God is holy. He's calling us to holiness. If we're Christ followers and we're growing in sanctification, we should want to be a part of that Christian community where we're being challenged to live lives of holiness. And that's also helpful distinction.
Yeah. I mean, we see in our culture today, if you call out certain things in our culture that are controversial and you say that's sinful behavior, then someone goes, oh, you're spiritually abusive. Well, no, I'm very plain in the book that upholding God's ethics is not spiritually abusive. Now, of course, you could be a jerk about it. That's another question, right? You can do it in harsh ways, and I make that point. Correcting sin isn't abusive. Correcting sin abusively is abusive. And I do make that point. And I think that should be remembered too.
Yeah. All right, here's one of our questions, Dr. Kruger. So I'm a pastor. This is coming from our audience. I'm a pastor, leader. I've been accused of being spiritually abusive. What should I do first?
Yeah. So if someone comes to you as a leader and says, I think you're spiritually abusive, obviously you want to hear why they think that, right? But I think you take it to the leadership body that's designed to hold you accountable and ask them to evaluate the credibility of the claim. If it's a credible accusation, and by credible, I think what I mean is not proven, because you can't prove it until you've investigated it. When I say credible, I mean that it's not just some quacky, weird thing. Like, imagine someone says, I think you're spiritually abusive because you told me that my living with my boyfriend is sin. Okay, well, the elders aren't going to take that seriously as really spiritually abusive. But if there's a credible accusation, then the elders ought to institute a third-party investigation. And if the pastor's innocent, then he should welcome that. And as painful as it will be, that's probably the course of action if the claim is credible. Now, I know I gave you the 30-second version there. There's a lot more to say, but that's the quick.
Well, our friends here, they need to read the book. That's the bottom line. So they need to read the book. So here's on the flip side of that same scenario. I've confronted my pastor, one of their questions on abusive behavior, and have gone to other leaders, but they don't do anything. What should I do? How long until I potentially leave?
I cannot tell you how many stories I have heard and talked to of people who have been mistreated and they don't know what to do. Some of them have already acted and didn't get a response. Some of them haven't acted yet and don't know what to do. Some people say, well, maybe I should just leave, just move on. Those are really hard scenarios. I do tell people that I think depending on the level of abuse, some people just realize there's not going to be a fruitful resolution here. And maybe the abuse isn't so bad that it's worth addressing and they may move on. But if you do address it, you certainly would go to the abusive leader and say, hey, here's the things you did, and I find them to be really troubling, and I think you've sinned against me, and I want to bring that to your attention. And then you see how he responds. I mean, under Matthew 18, if he responds well, then maybe you've got some good hope there for repentance and reconciliation. I can tell you in the stories I've heard, at least, that the chances of you getting a good reaction in that first meeting are pretty low. So then you're going to have to go to the leadership board around them, and in some denominations, maybe even get to the point where you're officially pressing charges against somebody in ministry. Now, I can tell you this, and most people on the call probably know this, you've got to really weigh that, because it is a long, long, painful road when you start getting into judicial accusations against a minister. I'm not saying don't do it. We need victims to stand up and say the truth. I'm just saying you just have to have eyes wide open about what you're get ready to get into. I wish I could tell people that the system really works great, and that whenever an abusive leader hurts you, that it'll be addressed. I think we just know that's not true. If that were true, I wouldn't even have written my book because it wouldn't need to. It's just the reality that a lot of people go and the system chews them up and spits them out. And I'm so sad that happens, but that's one of the reasons I tried to address some of these things.
Well, I think one of the things you do a really great job of in the book is, while you come from a Presbyterian tradition, you're using language that really applies to our Baptist friends or non-denominational friends. And so that's also super helpful. So just to those who are listening in or maybe watch the recording of this, Dr. Kruger does a great job of the principles that found in the book really apply to any type of ministry context. So, Dr. Kruger, is spiritual abuse immediately disqualifying for a ministry leadership? What might repentance and restoration look like for someone that maybe has a reputation of the spiritual abuse?
Yeah. So if someone is genuinely spiritually abusive, then I argue in my book that they have disqualified themselves from ministry. And that doesn't mean forever. But it shows the kind of character behavior that's antithetical to what Paul lays out in 1 Timothy 3 about what an elder or pastor should be. So if it's determined that an elder should be certain things, and this particular individual is harming sheep, hurting sheep, abusing sheep, heavy-handed, authoritarian, trained, long trail of broken relationships in the past, then the leadership body should recognize that, at least at this point, that they should not be in a position of spiritual authority. And so, yeah, I think that shows a point where they're disqualified. Now, they're not disqualified forever, like anything. If they show real repentance and growth and can show progress, I think, you could see hopefully fruitful ministry down the road. And so, yeah, I think there's hope there, and I don't want to make it sound like there's not. But if there's that sort of track record there, you've got to deal with that. And I think that person has shown themselves not fit for the ministry. Now, I can tell you this, is that it's just very few abusive leaders recognize it about themselves. What would really be great is if they were confronted and they say, yeah, I see it, and I'm gonna voluntarily step down, and I wish that happened more. But sadly it doesn't. Now, this is not also the same thing as saying that if someone has a conflict, that they should just leave the ministry, right? Well, if that were true, none of us would be in ministry, because ministry has these missteps and these conflicts and these very painful relational interactions from time to time. But again, you're talking about, I trust, someone who's genuinely abusive, and I think they would be disqualified. And I have a whole chapter in the book on why that's the case.
Dr. Kruger, how has the book, the study, even the reaction to the book, how has that changed the way you think about ministry? And as a seminary president, how do you think about training future leaders with this in mind?
Yeah, one of the things I've been telling people in the podcast I've been doing is that I feel like I've learned as much from the book as anyone. And I guess that's sort of a truism, right, for authors. If you wrote the book, hopefully you learned something from it. But I really mean that. I mean, as I've written the book, I realized, wow, I like anybody now, I need to really give some deep thought to the way we train ministers here at RTS. Are we doing a good enough job here, thinking about these issues and helping people think about what leadership means or doesn't mean? And so, yeah, I've been working through in my own mind curricular changes, how to bring this issue up in ways that we can help address it. Because obviously at a seminary level, we're ahead of it, right? They're not in ministry yet. So we have a chance here to really make a difference over time. If we can keep people from becoming these type of people, then we've made a difference. And if we can keep other people aware of the issues so they can spot these kinds of people when they come around, that can make a difference. And so I'm optimistic that seminaries are really part of the solution here. We really need seminaries to get on board with what real leadership, God leadership includes and doesn't include. And I'm not suggesting that seminaries as a whole are somehow for abusive leaders. Of course they're not. It's not so much that they're that, it's just that they may not be aware. And I include my own self with that. I look back at my ministry 10 years ago and I'm like, I probably wouldn't even be able to define this. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, that's great. Actually, I first heard about your book from Dr. Moeller. I think it was when was the last T4G? Was that last year? I was in Louisville, and he mentioned your book was just about to come out, and so yeah, I think that's a great conversation for seminaries to have, and I'm really glad that you're on the front lines of that work and thinking through that. So as we talk about spiritual abuse and those who've experienced it, what resources might, and this might be something for Jason, if I kind of put him on the spot a little bit, how do we care for victims of spiritual abuse? Dr. Kruger, maybe you could start and then Jason can follow up. What resources are out there to help them if they've been through a situation or an unhealthy abusive culture?
Yeah, and I do want to hear from Jason on this, because I feel like he's going to have a lot more to say here. As I said, my book's mainly to other leaders, and I think he would have a lot to say in terms of how to heal and how to comfort people. I will say, though, that one thing I do point out in the book is for the victims of spiritual abuse, they probably need an external third-party counselor that's not part of the leadership structure of the church that they suffered the abuse in. And this is a mistake I see happen quite a bit, where a church has an abusive leader that harms a member seriously, and then the church says, oh, well, one of our other fellow elders will, take care of you. And then the person who got abused was like, well, aren't you like best friends with the guy who hurt me? And when I talk to you, are you talking to him about what I'm saying? And how can I trust you're really for me? And so one thing I'll say, and Jason can round me out here, is I think, there's some genuine counseling there that doesn't mean you can't get some counsel from your own church. That's not my point, but you need to have some anchor outside of it from a third party, I think, that can really give you independent assurance that they're for you and are going to help you heal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd agree. I think, that having community in the church get around you, having friends, but having that counselor outside of the church that has been abusive, because I think one of the things with spiritual abuse is it can so easily feel like it's not just the pastor that abused you, but that pastor represents the authority of God in the church. And that oftentimes gets conflated and confused, and they're having to work through that, like, because of that position of authority that you mentioned. So I find, having a trusted counselor who knows trauma, knows abuse, and loves the church still, I think is for the church, Big C church, and can partner with the church but really be for that person. I think that's so helpful and so key. And again, finding somebody a counselor who has experience working with abuse and trauma, that's also very key, because there's so many complicating factors. It's not, we tend to want it to be simple. We want it to be, as efficient as possible. And oftentimes when it comes to abuse, in any kind of form and trauma, the timeline is dependent on the person and the situation. And so you really need not just one or two folks, you need a team of people, but people that know kind of what they have some experience with that as well.
I'll mention one more thing here I mentioned in the book, and Jason's right. I mean, what really helps healing is community coming around you, caring for you, supporting you. But in so many spiritual abuse cases, that's exactly the thing that's taken away from the spiritual abuse victims, because oftentimes they're blamed and accusations are made against them, and they're even driven out of their own churches. In fact, sometimes the abusive leader turns the church against the victim because the victims come forward making accusations. And so now, in the very moment you need community the most, is the very moment you now found that you have none. In fact, it's not just lack of community. You have people who now actively are against you that were your friends.
Yeah.
You can just imagine how incredibly crushing that is for people. I mentioned that not to be some pessimist. I just mentioned that to simply say that when we think about caring for abuse victims, it's going to be very complicated. And so Jason's right. You need somebody who really understands trauma abuse that can be there as a counselor.
Thank you both for that. Just a couple more questions here, and we're almost out of time. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions, and this is super helpful. Really, really appreciate Jason and Dr. Kruger weighing in on this. Dr. Kruger, it's been said that leadership can sometimes be a very lonely place. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about pastors, and if I'm sure you've seen the recent Barna study and just the conversation that's happening all throughout evangelicalism about pastors who are leaving the ministry and pastors who are often empty in their own pulpit, right? As far as relationships go, could you talk a little bit about friendships for pastors and the importance that would be? Because I think that's a part of this conversation, right? Is I know guys in my life, while I'm a nonprofit ministry leader, but I'm an elder at my church, and I want to have those voices speaking into my life for accountability and being aware of maybe weaknesses that I have. Can you just talk a little bit about friendships and relationships for pastors in particular?
Yeah, it's a great question. And when I wrote the book, there's a side of me that knows that a number of pastors are going to get the book and think, oh no, here we go. One more anti-church book, one more anti-pastor book. It's just going to stir up a bunch of people who already don't like pastors. And I get that. I really do. I'm a pastor. Look, and part of the reason I think someone in a similar role to me that needed to write this book is precisely because of that objection. Some pastor needs to write a book and say, guys, I know this is hard, but we need to take a really hard look at this. And so I just want to say at the front end, I understand how hard it is for pastors out there. I really do, because I'm one and I'm sympathetic to it. It's hard to lead, and people criticize you, and there's a lot of pastors who want to drop out right now. I get that. And so, yeah, friendships are key there to longevity, and friendships are key to accountability. In this call, can I give you the solution to that and say, oh, here's the 5 steps to having more friends? Boy, I wish I could. I'm sure I could suggest some steps. I think I can just simply acknowledge it is a real problem. And it's not a new problem. People in leadership have a really hard time having peers around them that they can be vulnerable with for obvious reasons. You feel like, especially in a spiritual context, you feel like you can't really be real with anyone. You're always on duty all the time as a pastor. You're hanging out with your church. You're still kind of, quote, on duty. That becomes very exhausting and very isolating. So I would just encourage churches that you got to work really hard to make sure your pastor has got friends and is cared for. Don't just assume they are. And pastors need to make sure they're looking for and entrusting themselves to people who can be those friends. But that's not a problem that can be easily solved. And I think it's a good one to point out.
Well, again, we're here with Dr. Mike Kruger from RTS Charlotte, author of Bully Pulpit. I would like to point out that there is another Bully Pulpit. This is not intended to be corrective because Dr. Kruger, you said.
No, I'm aware of that. It's about Roosevelt. Yeah. So,
right.
I meant about spiritual abuse. Sorry.
Right.
So,
No,
yeah.
you said that. That wasn't intended to be corrective. But I've got.
No, that's good. Yeah. Don't buy that one. Well, you can buy that one, but don't think you're buying my book. So.
And it's I don't know, 10 times the size of your book too, but
yeah,
I have that sitting.
It's a big biography of I guess it's Theodore Roosevelt. I can't remember.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, it's about Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and the golden age of journalism, but that's not what we're talking about here. Dr. Kruger, one of my last questions for you is the first tip that you gave us: character over competency. And this I've been a Christian for over 20 years. This feels like, as I ask you the question, like a very basic question. But where do I start? Maybe just give all of us a reminder when we're talking about Christian character. How do I know that I'm pursuing that character over competency, as you talk about?
Yeah. So, there's two layers to this. One layer is someone who themselves is evaluating themselves. Am I fit for ministry and so forth? And then the church's perspective on how they evaluate candidates. The ultimate determiner of character is that we want our ministers to look like Jesus. Okay. When we say look like Jesus, we don't mean perfectly. We don't mean infallibly. We don't mean they're not sinners. Of course they are. And anybody in ministry knows that we in ministry know how bad our sin. We know that we're bad sinners. And I think most people in ministry probably wonder most of the time whether they should be in ministry. Okay. You just need to know that. And so we're already aware of our failings and weaknesses, but there is still a minimum type of person's character that needs to be evaluated. In terms of whether they're fit for ministry. Look, there's many really great Christians who are not called to the ministry. You don't have to be called to the ministry to be someone who loves Jesus and serves him, right? So we're talking about those in spiritual authority here, not just across the board. And so the Bible warns people in this. Realize that God judges you more strictly when you take these roles. Don't presume that you're going to just take them on lightly. And so I would really say, as you evaluate yourself, that you ask people in positions who know you and say, hey, what do you see in my life? Where do I need to grow? Do you think I have the type of character that's going to be helpful in ministry and not harmful? One of the things I remind people of about why character matters so much in people in ministry is because they have so much weight and impact on the people they talk to, and they don't even realize it. I tell my students all the time, you don't believe me when I tell you this, but someday you're going to be in the pulpit and your words will have much more impact than you realize. You're going to think people aren't listening to you, and some won't be, but your words have the potential for disproportional good, and your words have the potential for disproportional bad. It's just the weight you've been given. And so you need to realize if you're given that kind of responsibility, you've got to be the right person to wield it. So I just think we need a whole new calibration of this. I think it starts with humility. A person saying, I'm not going to presume I'm ready. I'm not going to presume I'm fit. I got to go and make sure that I am by going to the right people and getting feedback. I think that posture alone is the kind of posture that doesn't fit an abusive leader. Abusive leaders are notoriously overconfident, right? They're like, oh, I'm the greatest. I'm totally ready and nothing to see here. And I think if you can just show a little humility, you're probably already on a good path.
That's great. And of course, you're kind of hinting at some of the biblical qualifications, right, that we find in Titus 1, 1 Timothy 3, 1 Peter 5, some of the basic qualifications for pastoral ministry and qualifications for elders. Dr. Kruger, we are so thankful for just your generosity with your time today and for writing this book. And we want to commend that book to you as a great resource for anyone serving in ministry, especially those who are on the front lines of ministry. Of course, we at ECAP, Evangelical Council for Abuse Prevention, we're really focused on child protection, but some of our standards directly address this issue related to governance. And so in some of your tips about accountability over secrecy, openness over versus defensiveness, we would, want to be a resource to help ministries specifically with child protection. And we believe that good child protection starts with good and godly governance. Be sure to check out another link that Brigham has posted here that ECAP we have permission to share this from our friends at ECFA. Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability. They've been dealing with good governance for decades. And we just want to commend these resources to you. Be sure to check out Bully Pulpit. If you don't have a copy, again, contact ECAP through our website, and we will send you a free copy in the mail while we have supplies available. So Dr. Kruger, thank you so much. Any final comments to us as we wrap up our time together? Anything else that you'd like to share?
Well, just thanks for being on the call and being interested in this. I mean, look, part of my reason for writing the book is I just want it on people's radar. They're just on the radar, that it's amazing how much that can help. So I know for most people on this call, it's probably already on your radar for other reasons, but hopefully you can take it back to your ministries and really help people see these things more clearly.
The ECAP website has a number of resources both on governance and child protection. And so if you're a ministry that serves children or youth, be sure to go to the Start Here page on ecap.net. We welcome the opportunity to serve and support your efforts as you seek to be faithful in training up and raising up the next generation. We exist to help churches in the U.S. and U.S. territories create safe places for kids to hear the gospel and to grow in discipleship. Of course, spiritual abuse is absolutely related to that topic. And so thankful for Dr. Mike Kruger, RTS Charlotte, to be our guest here on Meet the Experts.
So if you go to my site, michaeljkruger.com, it's called Cannon Fodder, which is, a pun, in case you didn't know that. But anyway, it's you go under videos and or interviews, and it'll show all the interviews there that I've done. Not all of them, but a number of them I've done on Bully Pulpit.
Great. Okay. Thank you, sir. Really appreciate your time. Thanks, everybody, for being with us. Thanks to Gospel Care Collective, Jason Kovacs from Canada there, and sponsoring this event. We're so thankful for you. Be sure to reach out to us if we can serve you in any way. So thanks, everybody. Have a great day, and we'll see you again next month. Thank you, Dr. Kruger.